Okay, good morning students. Welcome to today's HBL lesson. We have this recording about to go through some of the theory for geographical matters with you. And then after that, you have to respond to some questions in Google Classroom to apply your learning. Okay, now if you're not sure which place you are referring to for this topic, we are looking at this textbook, Geography in Everyday Life, and if you have to look at topic 3, which we haven't really covered, is geographical methods. Okay, so how this will be taught is that you will learn some, practice some, do the fieldwork, then through the reflection of the fieldwork and handling of your fieldwork data, you will have a chance to learn the content. Why do we do it this way? Because we find that students learn the content better, and they will also be able to answer the questions better. Okay, now usually for these questions, it's thinking questions, application questions, so deep understanding is crucial. So what is geographical methods about? So geographical methods is about how do we collect data and make geographical knowledge. So when we go and collect this information and we design what to do about it and we conclude about it, it is called a fieldwork. Usually involves these 5 steps, and this is not new to some of you, especially students who do pure science, because this is very similar to any subject in the world that try to make their own knowledge. Okay, so you might see this in science, you might see this in other subjects. All right, and when I was in university creating my own knowledge or doing my own projects and research, we also went through a similar steps. Okay, so the whole topic will cover different parts, and you will go through and experience different parts to learn more about it. Now, our focus today is on number 1, what do we want to study, and most importantly, what is our scope and what do we want to do about it. All right, and then at the end of the recording, as part of your HBL assignment, you'll be given time to brainstorm of possible scope for your fieldwork. So firstly, research question, hypothesis, what is this about? So basically, before we start investigation, we will always craft a research question or a hypothesis. Okay, now these are difficult terms, new terms, proper terms. But if you think about it from day-to-day life perspective, you will find that it is something very natural. So before we find out about things, we will always have questions. Okay, for example, I look at someone today, how come this person suddenly is wearing red shoes? All right, so I have questions. Why is this person wearing red shoes? So that could be the research question. I'm going to focus on that person and the red shoes. Okay, as kids, we may have a lot of questions, right? Like, how come this flower is blue in color? Okay, so our research question is, why is this flower blue in color? Okay, so from there on, when we find out more, the focus is on what makes the color blue for that flower. What are the factors? How did it happen? Okay, so research question is basically a question, okay, please highlight with me, a question that comes from what you are curious about. Okay, it usually starts from an observation. It usually happens when there is very little research done. So this will then scope the whole geography fieldwork to focus on these things. So one example of a research question, why is the wind speed in the school higher in semester 2 instead of semester 1? So this question would then scope down my research to focus on wind speed, as well as semester 2 and semester 1. Okay, I'll put a pause here. You might be thinking, why did I bring in climate? This is because when you are tested these things on geographical methods, they did not specify what topics can test you. Okay, so it can be on tourism, it can be on climate, it can be on tectonics, it can be anything under the sun. In fact, one of the specimen paper talks about visitors, how much they like a certain place in Singapore. Okay, you need not read up the content, it's just the application of the skills. All right, just like in SS, we apply source-based skills regardless of what kind of source and what kind of case study they give us. Okay, so don't worry about the content of the investigation. All right, focus more on your skills and applying the skills. Okay, so for this case here, let's say they give you a content from climate, a research question from climate. I think from here you are still able to understand that they have scoped down to wind speed, semester 2, semester 1, and not just wind speed in anywhere, but wind speed in the school. Okay, so let's try to think of one for tourism. What are you curious about for tourism? So for example, I may be curious, is tourism sustainable in Singapore? Okay, So that has scoped down my research to just Singapore, and my focus is on whether tourism can sustain, can last into the future. All right. Some of you may have different things. Like for example, some of you may prefer what makes Singapore popular and things like that. So now question time. Okay, a question will pop up and please answer them. All right, so I hope you've given yourself an example that you cannot use mine. Now next part, hypothesis. Once we have a research question, we will come out with a explanation or an idea. Usually it is a temporary one, okay, or might be a smart guess or prediction to answer the research question. So my example earlier, okay, I asked about why is this person wearing red shoes? So my hypothesis might be, oh, that person is angry today. Or the question about is tourism sustainable in Singapore? Maybe the hypothesis can be Singapore's tourism is not sustainable, or Singapore's tourism is sustainable, but I must explain. So why is that the case? So Singapore's tourism, maybe my hypothesis is Singapore's tourism is not sustainable as it is not environmentally friendly. So I need to go and find out, scope down even further that is on the environment, our practices. All right. Now, a hypothesis usually are not always the case. Usually consists of two variables. What are variables? Variables are things that can change. Okay. So for example, hair length is a variable. It can be long, can be short. Eye shape is a variable. Some people have big eyes, rounded eyes. Some people have small, narrow eyes like myself. So for this case here, tourism, whether is it sustainable or not, is one variable, and whether is it friendly or not is another variable. So if I were to go back to this example over here on wind speed, so wind speed is the variable, wind speed in the school rather is the variable, and then whether it is semester 2 or semester 1, the time, that is the other variable. For this, I may be saying that the wind speed in school is higher in semester 2 than in semester 1 because of the animals that appear. Okay, so animals that appear becomes a variable. Okay, and now if you have difficulty crafting hypotheses, you can always take it as a relationship between two variables. Now in your notes you mentioned independent, dependent. I will explain it later. So for example, I mean, how come coastal places is colder than places that's inland? So the distance from the sea, coastal or inland, is a variable now, and the temperature is another variable. So as a hypothesis, I may link these two together. I may say that when I increase the distance from sea, the summer temperature will decrease. Okay, so your turn now. I want you to try a few questions and come up with your own hypothesis. So we have this thing, hypothesis will answer the research question. All right. Now, then what are variables? Variables make up your hypothesis. Okay, so you can see as a two-way direction. The research question scopes down the hypothesis, and the hypothesis link up the independent and dependent variable, or you can see as a upwards. These two will make up the hypothesis, and the hypothesis will answer the research question. Okay, so variable, we know that these are factors, controls that can be controlled or can be changed. Like for example, whether I'm close to the sea or not, whether is it semester 1 or semester 2, whether is it temperature, whether is it benefits or things like that. Okay, so we will use the term independent variable and dependent variable. All right, independent and dependent. Now you've learned in earlier topics, you also learned in language. Dependent means need to rely on something. So that means they are the ones who are affected by the other variable. Independent, as the name suggests, they don't rely on anyone, so they are the cause. Okay, and this is the effect. Alright, so if I take this for example, distance from sea will be the independent variable, because it is the distance from sea. In my hypothesis, I'm saying that the distance from sea is the one that changes the temperature in summer. Temperature in summer. Okay, so if I use this for example, then I'm saying that it is not sustainable because it is not environmentally friendly. So whether is it environmental friendly or not is the reason that led to whether the tourism in Singapore is sustainable or not. Yes, these diagrams are illustrated, right? Let's say these are different variables. Okay, the one that causes change, leads to change, will be the cause, the independent variable, and the one that receives this change is the dependent variable. All right. So it's like different variables. I pick the one that's relevant, or I draw a certain relationship to show how it works. That is a form of a hypothesis, which will then answer the research question we have. Okay, so we have three terms now: research question, hypothesis, and variable. Now, I'm going to come up with one example, and you need to come up with one example of a research question. What's the hypothesis that answer it? What's the independent variable involved? And what's the dependent variable involved? Okay, so I'm going to give a tourism example. All right, so for example, I'm curious, who benefits from tourism more? So I have narrowed down to only benefits and about tourism in Singapore. So what's my, maybe I just do a guess. So maybe my hypothesis is chicken rice sellers benefits more from tourism than other locals because their food is more popular. Independent variable, what made this the people who actually benefit more from tourism, whether the food is popular or not. So the product they sell, is it popular or not? That determines whether they benefit more from tourism or not. Okay, so independent variable is their product popularity of their product, and then the dependent variable will be who benefits more. Right? Is it the chicken rice seller? Is it the tissue paper seller? Is it the souvenir shops? Things like that. Okay, so can I get you to try to come up with one on your own? Okay, now let's move on to the next part. So now with this we have scoped down what kind of variables to find out to see what is the relationship. All right, now so what will happen is that for the field work we will then go and collect data for both variables to see whether is this really the relationship or not. Okay, so which is also why it's mentioned here that the hypothesis must be something that can be tested whether it is true or not. All right, through a study or experimentation. It cannot be something that I cannot measure, I cannot experiment. So for example, if my hypothesis is chicken rice sellers benefit more from tourism than other locals because of divine intervention, okay, then how do I go and measure a divine intervention? I cannot investigate that. All right, so since I cannot investigate that, then I cannot put it as my hypothesis. Okay, since the hypothesis have scoped down the variables to data that can be collected, so we need to ask what kind of data to collect then. So basically, data is information that we gather that will either be information about the independent variable or the dependent variable. I mean, for example, ask the customers of different stores, all right, selling different things, to rate how popular the product, or I can measure how many customers. Okay, then maybe benefit, I want to focus on monetary benefit, so I look at the differences in their business. Okay, so there's four kinds of data that we're going to look at. It's not really four kinds, but two kinds in one category and two kinds in another category. What I'm also saying that means there's primary data that can be both quantitative, that can be qualitative primary data. There can be secondary data that is quantitative and also qualitative data. Okay, so what is primary data? Primary data, I think you might have heard it before in lower sec. Primary data is basically data you collect by yourself. Okay, basically you take the measurement yourself. Okay, so for example, you are the one that go out on the street and conduct questionnaire, conduct interview with others. Okay, or you are the one who use the instrument to measure the temperature, for example. So primary data is about the data you collected yourself. Now, secondary data is basically data that's being collected by others, and then you take their data to use. Okay, so for example, I may look for a research article about tourism in Singapore. Maybe it's written by this professor who interviewed 100 tourists. Okay, so from there, I will use this information to see whether my hypothesis is correct or not. All right, so that kind of data is secondary data because it's collected by others. Okay, so other than this example, question time, can you list another example of a secondary data? Okay, so when you collect the data, it can be quantitative or qualitative. Okay, so quantitative comes from the word quantity. Quantity means how many. That means you can count. All right, so quantitative data refers to data that are numbers that can be counted. Now, the benefit of collecting quantitative data is that it's easy to consolidate because it's just numbers. I can find averages. All right, now qualitative data, qualitative comes from the word quality. Okay, so like, is this good or bad quality? So quality usually is in words, so it usually cannot be counted. Okay, now qualitative data has its benefits because it's usually more in-depth. Okay, so people can use more words instead of just numbers, but the problem is, of course, that words is much harder to consolidate and analyze. Okay, so in your fieldwork, we will get you to try to collect both quantitative and qualitative data so that when you analyze, you can feel the benefits and the difficulties. Okay, so example for quantitative data, examples, there's numbers. All right, I can talk about income. Income is something that can be there's numbers, right, that can be counted. I can also talk about number of something, number of people, number of tourists, number of customers. All right, and of course qualitative data, maybe you can ask people about their perceptions, their feelings, which they have to use words. Okay, but then again, perceptions can also be quantitative. Okay, why? Because sometimes we may ask people to tell me how they feel based on the number scale, right? So when it becomes a number scale, it is quantitative data. If it's through words, like I interview them, ask them to describe how they feel, that would be a qualitative data. Okay, so data type is not dependent on what variable I'm measuring only. It's also dependent on how I'm measuring them. Okay, question time. I want you to guess, is this qualitative or quantitative data? Now, I'm going to introduce two things to you that is not in the syllabus. You might have encountered it in your science, pure science. And the reason why we are teaching you this continuous and categorical data is because in the later parts of this topic, knowing whether your data is continuous in nature or categorical nature will help you a lot. Okay, so what is continuous data? Now let me just give you the visuals. Okay, so continuous data is basically on a scale. I can arrange it logically. Okay, and another way to look at continuous data is between two numbers, I have in between data like decimal point. Okay, so let's say between 10 degrees Celsius and 11 degrees Celsius, I have 10.1, 10.2, 10.3. I can even go more detailed, 10.125, 10.126. Okay, so when I can continuous data, so that continuous data is basically data that's usually numbers, and between data points, I can infer an in-between value, like what I told you just now. Okay, also the good thing about continuous data is that I can have decimal point, and that's most importantly, that is a logical way to arrange them. So like for example, the temperature I've shown you, I can arrange from small value to big value. Okay, now it is the arrangement of the value, not the name. So I can give you an example for continuous data. Maybe I can go for weight. All right, weight is a continuous data, right? Okay, I can arrange it in a logical manner. There's decimal points, and there's in between data points. I can infer in between value. So I weigh myself today. I weigh myself 1 week later. From I can infer the in between value. Right, another example, maybe when it comes to tourism, maybe income is another one. Okay, so income is, let's say, two person, rich and poor. I can infer, let's say I can arrange them in a certain logical manner. If I can have a decimal point, and I can infer in between values as well. Okay, so what do I mean by logical arrangement? So let's say I take another temperature, 80 degrees. okay, there's a logical way to arrange them. So I may possibly put them closer to 100 degrees and definitely after 10 degrees Celsius. All right. Categorical data, it comes from the word category. Category means different groups, right? All right. So what it also suggests is like this, is that it's usually words, but it can also be numbers. There is no way to arrange them in a logical way, and between data points, it does not make sense to have an in-between value. Now, what do I mean by that? Okay, so for example, number of students in 4E, number of students in 4F, there is no in-between 4E and F. All right, now, so then what, how do I, it doesn't make sense to go and guess how many students is between 4E and 4F also. All right, maybe we can look at the CCAs in the school. Okay, uniform groups performing arts in clubs and society. Let's say between UG and clubs and society, there is no in-between CCA that I can infer from. Okay, rather they are separate categories. All right, and there's no way to arrange them in a logical manner. Okay, there's no way to say that, oh, based on clubs and society inherently would be in front, uniform groups must be behind, performing arts must be in the middle, or something like that. There is no logical way to put them on a scale. Okay, so by its nature of what it is, what kind of CCA it is, there is no way to put it on a logical scale. Now, if you tell me by alphabetical order, then you are actually just ranking the name rather than what the CCA is about. Okay, so I given you example of a CCA. Maybe for tourists, there can be like reasons why they come to a place. All right, or maybe like tourism product. These are the resources used to make a tourism product and things like that. Okay, so question time. All right, done. Now that we have gone through, quite a lot of terms. Okay, so firstly, at the first step of a fieldwork, we need to know what are we investigating. So it starts with a research question. What are we curious about? Okay, we will then come up with a hypothesis to temporarily answer this research question. And this hypothesis is a way to show what are the variables involved, what is the relationship involved, and which is the independent variable and which is the dependent variable, right? And from there, so now we have established the hypothesis, we will then go and collect data of the dependent variable and independent variable to determine if the hypothesis is true. Now, the data that we collect can be primary or secondary, depending on whether we collect it by ourselves. And whether it's primary or secondary, it can be quantitative, numbers, or it can be qualitative, usually words and description. And of course, the data that we choose can also determine whether it's continuous or categorical. Okay, so a lot of terms, please digest them. So after this recording, please proceed back to your Google Classroom. And from then on, you are supposed to think of all these, using all these terms that you have learned to come up with a possible scope for your tourism fieldwork. The next lesson, based on what you have submitted, probably we will group you from there. Okay.